Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm Kevin Costola, joined by Rania Kalik. Hey, Rania.
Hey, Kevin.
And we're very pleased to have as our guest this week, Ollie Vargas, who is a contributor for Kawsachun News, and he's based in Bolivia. Thank you for joining us, Ollie.
Thanks for having me on again. I believe this is the second time I've been on.
Yeah, it's and we always have really great conversation with you, and you're a very good expert on what's going on in the global South and Latin America. And we're having you on particularly to focus on Peru, but forgive us, we may veer into some other issues that we know you're knowledgeable about during our discussion. But to begin, I see that in the past week that there are human rights organizations, it looks like grassroots groups in Peru that are taking steps to try and use the judiciary to hold Dina Boluarte accountable for the massacres and the violence that have been inflicted on the population since the coup last year in 2022. And so, we would just like to maybe begin with what life is like on the ground right now for people and to give everyone an accounting of the violence that people are surviving daily as a result of this government that has been imposed on them.
Yeah, definitely. And as you mentioned, there's been some human rights organizations. Just recently, we reported on that at Kawsachun News, the International Mission of Solidarity and Human Rights, which is based in Colombia, recently visited Peru and declared that the government in Peru needs to be investigated for crimes against humanity. And they found evidence for crimes against life, that is the by the state, crimes against physical integrity, that means injuries, crimes against sexual integrity, that is to say the use of sexual abuse as a form of repression and torture against protesters, crimes against freedom of assembly and protests, offenses against freedom of transit, crimes against freedom of expression. And so these are all of the things that they found substantial evidence for going on in Peru at the moment, and for which the Peruvian government needs to be investigated. And I think the seriousness of these crimes and of the killings, I think, means that the government itself of President Dina Boluarte is kind of backed into a corner now. They can't really have a sort of negotiated way out of this, or negotiated way to leave power, because they're going to be prosecuted for all of this. And they've only got to look across the border to Bolivia, where their counterparts are being investigated, what are mostly in jail. The coup leaders of Bolivia of 2019, the majority of them are now in jail, including the president herself and many of the leaders. And they know that they will face the same fate if they step down. So I think they're running out of options. I think probably the only way for them to leave power would be if the United States were to give them permission to stay in presumably Miami or one of these places, or perhaps Orlando, where Bolsonaro currently is at the moment. But other than that, their only other option is to dig in further and create, what they call the peace of the grave, to repress protests to a point where people do have to just give up because of the scale of the killings and the repression going on. So I think it's a very serious. I think it's going to go on for a long, long time, many, many more months, both the protests and the repression itself, because the government wants to stay in power until 2024. That is the law that was passed by Congress, the ones that did the coup against Pedro Castillo. They want to stay in power till 2024, even though this government itself is not elected. And what people want is elections this year, and not next year.
So, what about the role of the U.S. here? Because obviously, the U.S. has been very supportive of this new government, if you want to even call it that. And then, of course, there was the U.S. ambassador meeting with the energy minister and the mining minister there. So, yeah, what can you tell us about the U.S. role so far in this coup?
Yeah, the ambassador to Peru has a very colorful CV, to say the least. She was a secretary to Mike Pompeo when he was Secretary of State. She was sort of part of his inner team during the Trump administration. She worked at the CIA for 9 years. She worked at the Iraq political office during sort of the occupation of Iraq, and she's worked in embassies in a lot of the places where the US is deeply involved in a lot of intervention. So places around the Middle East and Africa. So I think she's an operative. She's someone who knows how to get the job done, and she was brought in just right after Pedro Castillo was elected president of Peru. And I think we could see that as where before the US had a very friendly and close relationship with Peru. Peru was essentially a satellite state at that time before Pedro Castillo. And now that there would be a more independent government, they wanted to put someone who is more of an operator, an operative, and who has experience in these kind of interventions. So that's why she came in. She's called Lisa Kenner. And she is, from the moment there was the coup against Pedro Castillo, she's embraced the government, the new regime. And just about 2 weeks after the coup, while the massacres were going on, she sort of did a press conference where she announced that the US government will be sending a grant of $8 million supposedly to fight drug trafficking in Peru. I'm not sure what that sound is.
Yeah, neither am I. It's very strange.
Supposedly to fight drug trafficking in Peru. And I think this is a way to camouflage the fact that they were sending this money to the security forces that are committing these abuses. So if it was truly only to fight drug trafficking, they would have given that grant during Pedro Castillo's presidency, because Pedro Castillo never closed himself off to cooperation with the US, never expelled the DEA or USAID like Evo Morales did in Bolivia. He was very open to try and have a working relationship with the United States, but they never gave him that grant. They gave it 2 weeks after the coup against him. And this money, of course, goes to the security forces at a time where they themselves were telling the government that we're running out of tear gas, we're running out of bullets, we need more shipments to come in. And then the US comes in with this $8 million grant. So I think we can see it in that regard. And also the US has no interest at all in fighting drug trafficking in Peru, because Peru is the second largest exporter of cocaine in the world, right after Colombia. And the United States has numerous military bases in Peru, has the DEA all around Peru, and we've only seen drug trafficking increase during the past 20 years, whereas in Bolivia it has decreased, where the DEA was expelled. So
Thanks for watching the Unauthorized Disclosure Weekly Podcast. Please consider becoming a subscriber of our show. Go to thedissenter.org, sign up for $4 a month, and get early access to all our full episodes, as well as exclusive episodes that we post. We're in our 10th season, and we rely on people like you to keep producing conversations and interviews like this one. Now, back to the show. I want to read this from the State Department just to further our coverage of the U.S. role. So what we see is that we get statements like this from the State Department that the Deputy Secretary, Wendy Sherman, has gone and met with Peru's foreign minister, and the State Department tells us that the U.S. supports Peru and President Boluarte and her efforts to affirm Peru's democracy, ensuring peace, stability, and the unity of the Peruvian people, and that they've encouraged the government to continue to take steps to hold those responsible for acts of violence. And basically what we hear from U.S. officials and spokespeople is this all-sidesing of what's going on in Peru, that there's violence from the government. It's almost like there's just as much violence from the people who are being repressed. And I wonder what your comment would be on that, Ollie.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long history of the use of anti-terror discourse against people in Peru, and obviously it has its roots in the civil war that Peru had throughout the 90s with the Shining Path guerrilla group and the state. And since then, the number one way to attack the left has been to say you are terrorists. In Peru they say the terrucos, and anyone who expresses any kind of opinion against any kind of just social injustice, anyone to the left of the most hard line sort of neoliberals, even liberals, NGOs, sort of type people are branded as terrorists in Peru. And of course, once you call someone a terrorist, that means that you can use all necessary force against them, and that including killing them, including jailing them and torturing them. And that's why they've just launched this across. And the other discourse they've had is that this was funded by drug trafficker. The protests that are going on now are funded by drug traffickers and criminal groups. Of course, that's ironic since it's parties of the left like Peru Libre have pointed out that is with the presence of the US military bases and the DEA, their drug trafficking has flourished in Peru. And it suits the current setup, suits drug traffickers very well. So it doesn't make any sense at all that they would fund these current protests. And this discourse has an effect of mobilizing its own supporters, sort of the middle class in Lima, and the capital city. But in the rest of the country, it actually inflames things even more. It makes people more, more willing to go out onto the streets because they feel they're being assaulted. They feel their entire regions are being assaulted, their cultures, etc. As another way of explaining away the protest, the Peruvian government says that this is a conspiracy by Bolivia and especially Evo Morales. That they're the ones inciting this protest. They want to separate Peru and annex the Andean regions of Peru. And they point to the fact that Evo Morales was obviously a friend of Pedro Castillo. Evo Morales visited Peru on like 2 occasions. First one for Pedro Castillo's inauguration, in which new leaders from all around Latin America were invited, and he actually has now been banned from Peru, including a list of 9 other Bolivians, which include 2 of my friends as well, who were on this sort of team that went there to Peru for the inauguration. They're now being declared persona non grata by the Congress, and they're not allowed to enter the country, with their documents. And again, this one's a bit more complicated because there is a sentiment in the south of Peru, in the Andean regions of Peru, that admires Bolivia, because in Bolivia's achieved what protesters in Peru are asking for now. The protesters in Peru now are asking for a new constitution. That's been achieved in Bolivia in 2009. People in Peru want the nationalization of natural resources. That was achieved in Bolivia, both when Evo Morales was first elected and in the constitution itself, where it is illegal to privatize natural resources. And people want, an end to the discrimination and social exclusion, especially against the countryside, rural areas, rural indigenous areas. And that is what has been achieved in Bolivia with the plurinational state. So there is a huge amount of admiration by the protesters for Bolivia, a huge amount of admiration for Evo Morales. But the government uses this to say, oh, you're anti-Peruvian. You want to be Bolivian. You want to separate. You're separatists. You want to destroy the country, etc. And that's not the case at all. People want to achieve that within Peru. But yeah, nevertheless, there is a small minority. I mean, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but there is a small minority of people in Peru and indigenous leaders that are raising the question of, do we still want to be part of Peru when the capital city doesn't even want us? They discriminate against us. They don't recognize us as Peruvians. So why should we recognize ourselves as Peruvians? Do you understand? And why, we have the natural resources. The areas where there's the most protests right now is the areas with the most natural resources. That's something that worries the government. So in the south of Peru, you got lithium, right? You got gold, mining, all the mineral wealth. In the Amazon, you got oil, gas. So these are all the areas that are currently protesting the hardest right now, that are the most discriminated against, and which are the poorest, even though they generate all of the wealth of the country. And so there's The government in Lima is very concerned about that.
I'm curious if you can speak to the issue of racism in Peru. Amnesty International just came out with this report that, won't shock any of us about the role of racist bias in driving the lethal police response to the protests. But, there is this obvious history of extreme racism towards indigenous people in Peru that played out as soon as Pedro Castillo was elected, in fact. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually I lived in Lima for about 3 months a few years ago, and the way that people in Lima, the capital city, talk about the rest of the country is quite incredible, really. I mean, it's obviously the same themes that you get in every Latin American country, but I'd say Lima was the most intense I've ever witnessed,
Wow.
in that they do not recognize people, indigenous people, or people outside of Lima as actual Peruvians. And when people from those regions move to Lima, because those regions have been impoverished by the sort of centralizing economic system in which all of the wealth flows to the elites in the capital city. When people move to the capital city, they're called invaders, or they're called immigrants.
Wow.
How can you be an immigrant in your own country? But that's how people talk about it. And when I was there, it was just a time when we're starting to get like immigrants from Venezuela and Colombia, and they're seen as just the same as an indigenous Peruvian. They're not citizens of Peru, and that's why people felt resentful about that for a very long time, and now it's kind of all bursting out. It bursted out when Pedro Castillo was elected. That's part of why he was elected, and now it's bursting out in an even more radical way in which people are now willing to go to the streets. And yeah, there's a lot of other layers to it as well, because a big industry for Peru, apart from the natural resource exploits, obviously, is tourism. The Machu Picchu, backpackers, etc. That is a very important part of Peru's economy. And to promote that, they use indigenous culture, the indigenous textiles and clothes and music and dance. They use that to promote Peru's tourism industry, to make profits for the tourism industry. So they're happy to use the culture then, but in the rest of the year, when it's not to do with making money for the tourism industry, then they discriminate against that same culture. And there was a lot of photos and videos I remember that the people I know were posting about, especially the indigenous communities around Cusco, around Machu Picchu, that have a very, very colorful like ponchos and things that are always the people used in postcards and tourism guides and things like this. It's like, well, the country's made money off them and their culture all this time, and now they're marching. Will they be listened to, or will they be tear gassed and shot at? And surely when they go back to the communities, they'll be used again for promoting tourism and the hotel industry. So yeah, that people feel just dumb. People feel like they no longer want to obey the metropole, the capital city in Lima. The capital city in Lima doesn't even want them there in the country, doesn't despises everything about them. And people feel the link that ties people together as citizens, even beyond political divides, is kind of breaking, really, because there's just no respect anymore for people's different cultures.
So can you tell people about the general strikes that have unfolded in Peru? I think it's important to highlight the organizing that's been unfolding under these really oppressive conditions.
Yeah, so we see, I mean, when the coup took place against Pedro Castillo in December, we saw sort of protests and rallies and stuff all around the country. And then in January, I think it's January 4th, January 4th of January, we saw the start of official general strike. And what that meant, at the beginning, it was mostly in the southern regions of Peru, like the Andean regions. Well, what people did was, firstly, it was a general strike. I went there in January, crossed the border with Bolivia, and there was just like everything closed. Even the small little shop or bakery or whatever, everything absolutely completely closed down. And also they erect like barricades or roadblocks on the highways, using sort of big rocks or wood thing, or like just sort of metal barriers and things like this, including even the border itself between Peru and Bolivia. which is like a bridge. Even on the border itself between Peru and Bolivia, which is basically a bridge, um, they're being completely closed off using these sort of metal barriers, with barbed wire, so it's absolutely impossible to get across. And yeah, this is and this was done, all across the country, on all of the key highways across the country. Multiple ones on all the highways. And then this spread within about a week. This spread through to like the Amazonian areas. This spread through even to some coastal areas in the north of Peru, north of Lima, and it's just kept growing every day to the point where the whole country is paralyzed. All of the airports except for Lima itself were not operable anymore. And yeah, it's a total shutdown of the country, and that's still going on now. The government has cleared some of them through repression, especially the barricades erected near and around Lima. But especially in the Andean regions is still going on. There's still no way to get from Bolivia to Peru by land, or from Chile to Peru by land. Those borders are completely closed off, and this has been going on now for more than a month, like a month and a half. So this has had a huge impact, and it's also created in Lima itself, like in the capital city, like a sort of siege mentality among the middle class. They think, oh, the Indians are coming. The savages are coming. They're gonna burn down the city and all this sorts of thing. And then, in fact, like about 2-3 weeks ago, people did travel from the Andean regions to the capital city to intensify the protests. Some of them didn't make it because the government, stopped their buses and convoys from arriving. But in large numbers did make it, and it showed people forcing themselves to be visible to the capital city, and saying, you can't. This is not going to be brushed aside. We're going to stay here in the streets until there is a result. And yeah, I mean, the feeling I got from speaking to people there is that people are ready for the long haul. People are ready to go for this for months. Already it's gone on much longer than the sort of strikes and blockades that happened in Bolivia after the coup against Evo Morales. It's gone on now for like double that amount of time. So this is a very, very serious movement with a huge amount of commitment that's gone on for a month and a half now. It's going to go on for more, and involves a huge number of people, essentially the majority of the regions of the country. So yeah, I think this is quite extraordinary moment for the country and the region as a whole. And of course, it hasn't really received that much coverage in foreign media, despite the scale of what's going on, which is really quite historic.
Speaking of the issue of the media, I'm curious, how is local media covering this? Like, gonna give us the local media breakdown? Is there a lot of right-wing media like we see in other Latin American countries funded by various, pro-US oligarchs? And then I would add to that, can you talk a little bit about the way the foreign media has covered what's happening in Peru versus the reality on the ground?
Oh yeah, Peruvian media is really quite something. And the even going back to the election of Pedro Castillo, people I remember the front pages of some of the big newspapers saying, if Pedro Castillo is elected, this is how much the price of chicken will rise. Even though it hadn't actually happened, they were doing a sort of projections based just on their own sort of whatever they'd made up. And that was the sort of thing that they were using to try and stop people from voting for Pedro Castillo. And of course, people didn't really take much notice of that. And now there's, the discourse is people are terrorists, or they're saying that the left-wing sort of congressman of the Peru Libre Party, they're funding this. They're sending people to die. They're sending their own people to die for they're paying them $5 to go and protest and things like this. And yeah, the relationship with all the trust in the media is something that's completely broke down. And I remember even when I was there, when I was in the town on the border with Bolivia, Desaguadero, and I sort of had their sort of tripod I was filming, and there's some people who were shouting at me, "Prensa corrupta," corrupt media. I was like, no, don't worry, I'm Bolivian. They're like, oh, that's fine, okay, don't worry. because they had zero trust. Even just seeing someone from the media there, put everyone on edge, and people were shouting, shouting abuse and stuff. Until, and I made it clear that I was from Bolivian media, so there was no agenda against them. So it was, that people are happy with that. But people didn't even want the media there at their own protest, which is a reversal perhaps of what you see in other countries where people want the media to come and cover things. People are so bitter towards journalists and the media, they didn't even want their presence. And I know this happened as well in Lima. I've got people I know from progressive outlets and stuff, and they were mistaken for mainstream media journalists, people shouting at them, the corrupt media and things like this, or racist media. And so, yeah, the trust between people and media is broken down. I'd say there's like perhaps one outlet that has given more balanced coverage. It's called La República. It's kind of like the Guardian of Peru, sort of a liberal newspaper, which heavily supported the coup against Pedro Castillo. But now that the consequences are playing out, they try to sort of distance themselves and speak out for human rights and things like this. But they themselves were the ones urging the Congress, the right-wing majority Congress that are now doing all of this, that are now in government. They were urging them to get rid of Pedro Castillo. Around Latin America has been quite interesting. People try to use the issue for their own domestic politics. So like in Bolivia, the right-wing media in Bolivia has been saying, oh, look, Peruvians reject Evo Morales. Peruvians declare persona non grata, declare Evo Morales as a persona non grata, and he's now banned. Of course, they're not Peruvians. It's a Peruvian regime which represents a minority of Peruvians. The majority of Peruvians are actually, have a huge admiration for Bolivian Evo Morales. But that's how the Bolivian media tried to spin it. In Colombian media, for example, the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, has actually been quite outspoken about this, and in condemning the repression of the government in Peru. And in Colombian media, they're saying, look, he's allied with the terrorists in Peru. We always knew he was a terrorist. The left is, a bunch of terrorists. And so it's interesting how in different countries, they're trying to use the Peruvian issue, not to talk about the actual Peruvian issue, but to talk about it to sort of score points within their own countries and within their own sort of, political battles they have, personal, whatever. And so, yeah. And then when we go to outside, American or European coverage, etc., the first thing I'd say is that when the coup against Pedro Castillo happened, it's just uniform praise. We never really see that much coverage of Peru, just generally in sort of Western media, but like everyone covered that moment. Now saying this is a victory for democracy. It's a victory for institutions in Peru. And then when the killings start happening, when the massacres start happening, we see, the process of washing one's hands. And now we see, and then, outlets like The Guardian or the New York Times have been willing to talk about, the repression and the massacres, etc., but not putting it in a political context, not putting it in the context of what happened was a coup against Pedro Castillo. The funniest thing I saw was, I don't know if you guys know this, like academic like group, WALA, the working group on Latin America, has sort of various people that you might know writing for it, sort of very liberal. And they put out a statement saying, we urge Joe Biden to condemn the massacres in Peru. If you're ruining America's name by not speaking out, and we know you want to speak out, so just say something, and this will restore America's name. And of course, that nothing was said. Well, things were said. They sent people from the State Department to have meetings with the new regime and praise them and give them grants and channel funding to them. So that was what was said.
All right. So not to be judgmental, but I know that during these months, there's probably been ample time for these movements and groups to reflect on what has been inflicted upon their country and the moment that came and what led up to Pedro Castillo being removed from power in this coup. And I'm wondering if you have anything to share about what has been learned by these organizations, I would imagine that many of them would want to prevent this from happening again. I understand that's a very tall order and difficult. You're dealing with an oligarchy, you're dealing with outside influences, and you a lot of those things are not really in the population's control. However, um, you know, are there any things that you're hearing as you follow this that people say, the next time we get power, the next time we have control of this government, we're going to remember to do this so that we don't go through this again?
One of the biggest weaknesses, which I think people in Peru themselves have realized, is that is although the mobilizations, for example, are very similar to what we saw in Bolivia in 2019 against the coup here, the one massive difference is that there's no leadership at all, really. There's definitely no political party. In Bolivia, for example, there was one party, the movement towards socialism, which had under it with sort of which was the umbrella for all different movements in different regions and cultures of the country. And that is something that just doesn't exist in Peru. The most amount of sort of unity that you'll see is in sort of individual regions and towns and things where you have like a union that can coordinate people, and they do that very successfully. I saw that. But, you know, when it comes to coordinating outside of your town and your region, coordinating on a national level, that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist at all. Um, the in terms of left wing political parties, you know, the ones in Congress, the ones that have elected representatives, don't really have any grassroots presence or support. They don't have any kind of movements affiliated to them. In fact, they've become quite discredited the past couple of years. The party that Pedro Castillo was elected on, Peru Libre, fell out with Castillo like a year ago. Um, they were basically split about three different ways like a year ago. And many of them actually voted to impeach Pedro Castillo. So people have just the trust in that party is kind of gone. Um, the other sort of left wing party in Congress is one called Juntos por Peru, which is kind of like a middle class sort of liberal party in the capital city. They focus mainly on like issues like environmentalism or like LGBT issues and stuff like this. They've never had any kind of roots among the actual people who are on the streets now outside the capital city. They're seen as a kind of middle class organization, sort of academics and students and things like this. So they don't have any power to sort of not just mobilize, but sort of give some sort of leadership as well to this. And then so what you end up having is a various sort of regional parties from this region, from that region, and one that makes it very hard for the movement to have an agenda about what we're actually going for and how it's actually going to be achieved, and there ends up being sort of more sporadic uprisings in different regions that are hard to channel into something effective, or to talk about tactics and or strategies going forward, because how can you talk about that if you're basically only talking for yourself or talking for like one region when there's like numerous other regions doing their own thing and who are not going to listen to you because you're not from there. So it's that I think is certainly the biggest weakness. Even if there was elections right now, even if the government was to grant the demand of protesters, how useful would that even be at this point? Because who's going to stand unless someone emerges right now as a kind of charismatic figure? The vote would be split again between a number of different parties, sort of national parties and regional parties. So it's a very, very the political question is is the most complicated one, and perhaps coming out of this, a process would begin in which people can begin to form and articulate such a political movement. But at the moment, it just doesn't exist, and all of the ones that do exist have been discredited or have had dealings with the people currently in power. So it's that I think is the thing that is on people's minds the most. But at least people know now that there is a capacity to bring people onto the streets. If someone does call people out, people will turn up to a protest, to a rally, to a strike, and people are willing to even put themselves and their safety on the line. That's how committed people are. It just needs a greater level of articulation, and to end some of that division and to bring, and it has to begin, I think, with the actual movements and social movements rather than with the political parties. The political parties are mostly based in Lima. They have their own sort of personal fights that they have with each other. But I think they can look across the border to Bolivia, where the process of building a movement towards socialism was about building coalitions of movements, and from there creating a political instrument. And that's what doesn't exist in Peru, and that's what I think would be the most important challenge, not only for the current moment, but to contest like elections and stuff in the future. Because if otherwise it's going to be further splits again, and in which people and therefore end up having to give their vote to a liberal candidate. That's what happens. That's what's been happening in most of the past elections in Peru, is where the hard right, sort of Fujimori, far right groups come like first with like 35% of the vote, and then in second place there's like a liberal candidate with like 30% of the vote, and then like 3 or 4 left-wing parties with like 10% each. And then those people have to then give their vote to the liberal candidate in the second round of a presidential election to stop the far right. And then those, the liberal, sort of neoliberal candidate governs in the same way, and there's no change. So, and they're doing that with the votes of the left, because the people had to do that to stop the far right. And that's a cycle that just keeps repeating itself. The cycle people thought they'd broken with Pedro Castillo, but I think could repeat itself if there's not a clear left candidate like Pedro Castillo was.
I want to zoom out for a moment and ask about what has been the significance of this legislative coup in Peru taking place at a time when there's all these left-wing governments surrounding Peru around the region, whether we're talking about Colombia, Venezuela obviously is already left-wing, but you already had Venezuela and Cuba. Now you have, progressive governments in Colombia, in Brazil, in Honduras and Chile. I mean, obviously these are different across, parts of the spectrum, but regardless, they can be considered progressive and to the left to some degree. So has that made a difference in terms of the US's ability to use surrounding countries to justify or legitimize these sorts of things?
Yeah, I think that's massive. It's massive because if we go back to like 2019, when there was the attempted coup against Venezuela, with the sort of declaring Juan Guaido as a president and all this stuff, that was very effective, because almost all of Latin America at that time had right-wing governments. And so immediately when Trump activated the sanctions, he just told all of those governments to join in. I mean, Venezuela was completely isolated. All of its neighbors, Colombia, Brazil, were all they all had right-wing governments. So so not only were the sanctions coming from the United States, they're coming from Venezuela's own neighbors as well. And so Venezuela was not only economically isolated, but they are physically isolated, geographically isolated. And of course, with these countries like Colombia and Brazil, they have a lot of trade and things like this, and that was just cut off as well on the orders of the United States. Now that's not going to happen. In fact, Peru's the one that's isolated. Peru's the one that ended up having diplomatic arguments, and even to the point of breaking relations with Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Bolivia, even Chile. More recently, but to a lesser extent. So actually, all of their neighbors are rejecting them and don't want anything to do with them. So the situation has been reversed, and the government is very, very weak. They've tried, to reach out, but they themselves have been very aggressive towards the countries that condemn their repression. And yeah, I think that as well gives a lot of hope to the protesters on the ground. The people I spoke to, they were like, very, very grateful they even mentioned people like Andres Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, Luis Arce in Bolivia. They're like, we need them to come and help us and all these things. There's one guy I spoke to even says he wants Mexico to send in their military to liberate them from their regime in Peru. But that was obviously not a demand of the majority, but people are very grateful for the support that has been from countries like Mexico and Colombia and Bolivia. And Pedro Castillo's family are now in Mexico. They were given asylum in Mexico. They're living there now. And the Peruvian government has essentially like withdrawn their diplomats in protest about that. And so, yeah, I think, morally on the ground, this has given people a lot of energy. And, physically as well, it means the government is weaker and more fragile going forward. So I think that is very important. And as well, obviously, for countries like Venezuela or Cuba, Nicaragua, now they are now much less isolated as well than they were in 2018 or 2019, when you had people like Macri in Argentina, Ivan Duque in Colombia, Bolsonaro, all of this just surrounding them and turning the screws on the order of the United States.
Well, it's been really great to talk with you, Ollie. Thanks for giving us your time and coming on the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast.
No, thank you both. Very glad to be on again, and always available. Cheers.
Oh, and why don't you tell people where they can find your work so they can follow all the good stuff that Kawsachun's doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Kawsachunnews.com. We've got we got our own podcast as well, Latin America Review, where we go, take on some of these issues as well and more. Make sure to check that out on all the podcast apps, and you can become a subscriber on Patreon. Make sure to check that out on Twitter at Kawsachun News. My own Twitter is at Ollie Vargas 79. So yeah, man, see you on there.
Thank you. Thanks for watching the Unauthorized Disclosure Weekly Podcast. I'd like to ask you to please become a subscriber. Go to thedissenter.org, subscribe for $4 a month, and get access to all our full episodes, as well as the exclusive episodes that we post.